He ruled with money, fear, and silence. No one dared to challenge him. But when she walked in, the man who controlled everyone finally met someone he couldn't control. Welcome back, my amazing family and friends. If you're ready to dive into this unforgettable story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll bring you another incredible tale you absolutely can't miss. Let's get started, and don't forget to like and share to help our community grow. Theodore Grant's corner office overlooked Manhattan like a kingdom beneath a throne. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in geometric precision, steel, glass, and ambition stacked toward heaven. Everything in the room spoke his language: control. The desk, a monolithic slab of black walnut. The chairs, positioned exactly 6 feet from his seat. The temperature, a constant 68 degrees. Even the silence had rules here. Theodore stood at the window, 52 years old and carved from the same unforgiving material as his empire. Silver threaded through his dark hair with distinguished precision. His suit, bespoke and midnight blue, fit like armor. His jaw, sharp enough to cut glass, had never softened for a smile that reached his eyes. Those eyes, slate gray and merciless, had watched grown men stumble over apologies, watched competitors surrender before negotiations began, watched 15 years of absolute authority cement itself into legend. No one challenged Theodore Grant. Not since he'd built Grant Industries from his father's crumbling real estate firm into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. Not since he'd earned his reputation for crushing dissent with the efficiency of a machine. Not since the divorce that had frozen whatever warmth remained in him, leaving behind only the empire and the ice. His assistant, Peter, mousy, 43, and terrified, knocked with the rhythm of a man who'd learned Theodore's patterns like scripture. Enter. Theodore didn't turn from the window. Peter slipped inside, tablet clutched like a shield. Sir, the Heritage Foundation meeting is in 10 minutes. The candidates for the Minority Business Initiative grant are waiting in Conference Room A. And all 5 have been vetted according to your specifications. Revenue projections, scalability assessments, leadership profiles. Peter's voice carried the mechanical quality of a man reciting gospel. However, there's one irregularity. Theodore turned. Slowly. That glacial pivot that made board members sweat. Irregularity. The 5th candidate, Jade Morrison, Morrison Analytics, she wasn't on the original list. The foundation board added her last night. Unanimous vote. Peter swallowed. I flagged it as a protocol violation, but they insisted she meets every qualification. Actually exceeds them. Theodore's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. The slightest crack in the ice. They insisted. Yes, sir. To me. Yes, sir. The silence stretched like a blade. Theodore adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, engraved with his initials, with movements as precise as surgery. Then Ms. Morrison has already broken her first rule. Tell the board we'll begin in 15 minutes. I have a call to make. Peter fled. Theodore returned to the window, but he wasn't seeing the city anymore. He was seeing the pattern, the one that had kept him untouchable for 15 years. People learned quickly in his world: follow the rules, or face the consequences. The foundation board knew this. Every grant applicant knew this. The fact that someone had been added without his explicit approval meant either gross incompetence or deliberate provocation. He suspected the latter. His phone buzzed. A text from his head of security. Morrison just entered the building. Arrived in a 10-year-old Honda. Wearing a blazer that's seen better days. Carrying a leather portfolio that's literally held together with duct tape. Theodore's jaw tightened. Another pattern. The underdogs always arrived like this. Humble, scrappy, designed to appeal to sympathy. He'd seen it 100 times. They thought poverty was a credential, that struggle justified mediocrity. They were always wrong. He straightened his tie and headed for Conference Room A. The conference room was another monument to Theodore's aesthetic. Glass table, ergonomic chairs positioned with geometric precision, walls lined with awards that documented Grant Industries' dominance. 5 candidates sat along one side of the table, each occupying their assigned space with the rigid posture of people who knew they were being judged. 4 of them, anyway. Jade Morrison sat at the far end, the seat closest to the door, the position usually reserved for latecomers or low-priority attendees. But she didn't sit like someone relegated to the margins. She sat like she'd chosen the spot deliberately, one leg crossed over the other, her scuffed blazer unbuttoned to reveal a simple white blouse, her natural hair pulled into a high puff that crowned her head like defiance itself. She was studying the awards on the wall with an expression Theodore couldn't immediately classify. Not impressed. Not intimidated. Something else. Amused. Calculating? When Theodore entered, the room stood as one. Except Jade. She turned her head, met his eyes, and smiled. Not the nervous smile of the desperate. Not the obsequious smile of the ambitious. A real smile, the kind that suggested she found something genuinely interesting about this moment, about him, about the game she'd just entered. "Mr. Grant," she said, and her voice carried the warm, unhurried cadence of someone who'd never learned to shrink herself. "Thank you for having me." Theodore stopped mid-stride. The others had offered formal greetings, rigid and rehearsed. She'd offered gratitude? As if he'd done her a favor by allowing her presence. "Ms. Morrison." He moved to his seat at the head of the table. "You're aware you weren't on the original candidate list." "I am." She leaned back in her chair, actually leaned back, as if this were a coffee shop and not a firing squad. "The foundation board reviewed my application after the deadline. I'm grateful they saw the potential. The deadline exists for a reason. So does potential." Her smile never wavered. Sometimes rules need to bend for exceptional circumstances. The room held its breath. The other four candidates looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Peter, stationed by the door with his tablet, had gone pale. Theodore Saturday steepled his fingers. "In my experience, Ms. Morrison, people who dismiss rules do so because they lack the discipline to follow them." "In my experience, Mr. Grant," Jade said, matching his tone with unsettling precision, "people who worship rules do so because they're afraid of what happens when they're challenged." The silence that followed could have cut diamond. Theodore studied her. Really studied her. Mid-30s. Probably. Eyes that caught the light like polished amber. Hands that didn't fidget or perform, just rested on the table with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were worth. The duct-taped portfolio sat beside her like a trophy, not an embarrassment. "This grant," Theodore said slowly, "represents $500,000 in funding, mentorship from Grant Industries' executive team, and access to networks that take most people decades to reach. Why should it go to someone who's already demonstrated she doesn't respect the process?" Jade tilted her head. "Because I'm the only person in this room who'll tell you the truth. Which is that you're not looking for potential. You're looking for obedience." She gestured to the other candidates, all of whom looked mortified at being included in her rebellion. "These four are brilliant. Their businesses could change communities, create jobs, shift economies. But they walked in here ready to perform gratitude, ready to shrink themselves small enough to fit your expectations. You don't want innovation, Mr. Grant. You want control." Theodore's expression was carved stone. "And you think defiance is innovation?" "I think authenticity is." Jade leaned forward now, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that felt like a physical force. "Morrison Analytics uses AI to predict economic trends in underserved communities. My algorithms have a 92% accuracy rate. I've helped 3 small businesses avoid bankruptcy and 2 nonprofits secure funding they would have missed. I did this from a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with equipment I bought secondhand and software I taught myself to code." She tapped the duct-taped portfolio. "I didn't come here to bow. I came here to partner. If that breaks your rules, then maybe your rules need breaking." The room was a vacuum. Theodore felt something he hadn't felt in years, the uncomfortable twist of being off balance. This woman, with her impossible confidence and her refusal to perform, had walked into his empire and declared it insufficient. And God help him, he was intrigued. "We'll begin the presentations," he said, his voice betraying nothing. "Ms. Morrison, you'll go last." She smiled again. "Wouldn't have it any other way. What do you think? Have you ever had to break the rules to prove your worth, or do you believe success comes from working within the system? Drop your thoughts below." The first 4 presentations had been exactly what Theodore expected: polished, cautious, designed to check every box on his unstated list of requirements. A logistics startup that promised efficiency. A sustainable fashion brand that projected modest growth. A community health app with conservative projections. A food delivery service targeting underserved neighborhoods with safe, incremental expansion plans. Each presenter had stood at the front of the room, clicked through slides filled with charts and graphs, and spoken the language of people who'd learned to translate their dreams into something palatable for power. They were good. Professional. Forgettable. Theodore had taken notes with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything, his face revealing nothing. But beneath the ice, something restless had been building. Each presentation felt like watching people volunteer for smaller versions of themselves, and it irritated him in a way he couldn't name. Now Jade Morrison stood at the front of the room, and she hadn't opened her portfolio. "I'm not going to use slides," she said, and the statement landed like a stone in still water. Theodore looked up from his notes. The grant application specifically requests a formal presentation with supporting materials. "I know what it requests." Jade moved to the center of the room, positioning herself not at the podium but in the open space between the table and the window, between Theodore and his view of the kingdom. "But I'm not here to show you what you've already seen 100 times. I'm here to show you what you're missing." She had everyone's attention now. The other candidates watched with expressions caught between horror and fascination. Peter's fingers hovered frozen over his tablet. And Theodore leaned back in his chair with the slightest narrowing of his eyes, the predatory focus of someone who just spotted unexpected prey. "Grant Industries invests in minority businesses," Jade continued, "because it looks good. Because it checks diversity boxes. Because it generates positive press and tax benefits. I'm not judging, that's how the game works. But let's be honest about what this is: charity with a return on investment." "Ms. Morrison," Peter started, but Theodore raised one hand. Silence fell. "Continue," Theodore said. Jade's smile was sharp now, a blade with an edge. "Morrison Analytics doesn't need charity. What we need is a partner who understands that the next economic revolution isn't going to come from another app that delivers groceries faster or another platform that connects freelancers. It's going to come from the places you've been ignoring." She moved to the window, standing beside Theodore's sight line. "There are 42 million Black Americans. Collective buying power of $1.6 trillion. Hispanic Americans? 62 million people, 1.9 trillion in buying power. But the algorithms that predict market trends, that guide investment strategies, that determine where capital flows." She turned to face the room. "They're built on data that ignores us. We're statistical noise. Rounding errors." Theodore's pen had stopped moving. "Morrison Analytics has spent 3 years building something different," Jade said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd fought for every word. "We've created predictive models specifically designed to track economic patterns in communities of color. We can tell you which neighborhoods are about to gentrify before the real estate developers figure it out. We can identify emerging markets in places your analysts have written off. We can predict consumer trends that won't hit mainstream radar for another 18 months. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her portfolio. No duct tape this time, Theodore noticed. Just one crisp page that she laid on the table in front of him. "Last year, your investment team passed on a property development opportunity in Oakland. Too risky," they said. "Declining neighborhood, uncertain returns." Jade tapped the paper. "My algorithm identified it as a high-growth zone 6 months before your team even looked at it. That property just sold for 3 times its valuation. Your company lost $7 million because your data couldn't see what mine could." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Theodore picked up the paper. Scanned it. His expression was granite, but his jaw tightened, just barely, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. The data was accurate. He remembered the Oakland deal, remembered overruling his team's recommendation to pursue it. The loss had been acceptable then, barely a blip. But knowing it could have been predicted, that someone had seen what he'd missed. "You hacked our investment records," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I analyzed publicly available information and cross-referenced it with my models." Jade didn't flinch. "Everything on that page is legal. What's not legal is the amount of opportunity your company is leaving on the table because you're using data that's blind to half the market." Theodore set the paper down with controlled precision. "You're aware that Grant Industries could bury Morrison Analytics with a single phone call. That antagonizing me in my own conference room is possibly the worst business decision you could make. I'm aware that you didn't become a billionaire by playing it safe," Jade countered. And I'm betting that somewhere under all this, she gestured at the room, at the awards, at the carefully constructed empire of control, you still remember what it feels like to be hungry. Something flickered across Theodore's face. Fast as lightning, gone just as quick. But Jade saw it. That crack in the armor. That moment of recognition. $500,000, Theodore said slowly, buys a lot of things. Loyalty. Discretion. Gratitude. What makes you think it buys partnership? Jade walked back to her seat, but she didn't sit. She stood behind her chair, gripping the back of it, and for the first time Theodore saw the weight she was carrying. The exhaustion beneath the confidence. The years of fighting visible in the set of her shoulders. Because I'm not asking you to save me, she said quietly. I'm asking you to keep up. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a prayer. Theodore stood. The movement was fluid, controlled, but there was something different in it now. An edge of decision. Everyone except Ms. Morrison is dismissed. Peter, reschedule the remaining interviews for next week. The room erupted in polite chaos. Chairs scraping, murmured thanks, nervous glances at Jade. The other 4 candidates filed out with varying degrees of relief and disappointment. Peter hesitated at the door, clearly torn between protocol and self-preservation, before fleeing with his tablet. The door clicked shut. Jade and Theodore stood on opposite sides of the glass table, a barrier and a mirror. The late afternoon sun cut through the windows, painting everything in sharp angles of gold and shadow. You have exactly 5 minutes, Theodore said, to convince me why I shouldn't have security escort you out and flag Morrison Analytics as a hostile entity. Jade met his eyes without wavering. Because you're bored. Of all the things she could have said, that was the one Theodore hadn't expected. Excuse me. You're bored, she repeated, moving around the table toward him. Not aggressive, but deliberate. You've built an empire. You've crushed your competition. You've won every game you've played. And now you're standing in a glass tower, surrounded by people who are terrified to tell you the truth, going through the motions of caring about things that don't challenge you anymore. She stopped 3 feet away, closer than anyone else would have dared. I looked you up, Mr. Grant. I read every interview, every profile, every puff piece about the man who built Grant Industries from nothing. You know what I found? The last time you sounded excited about anything was 12 years ago, when you were fighting to acquire Meridian Tech and everyone said you'd fail. Theodore's hands flexed at his sides. You don't know anything about me. I know you haven't smiled, really smiled, in any photograph for the last decade, Jade said. I know you've automated your empire so efficiently that you barely have to show up anymore. I know that when I walked in here and challenged you, it was the first time you looked alive all day. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Theodore wanted to deny it, to crush this impossible woman with the same cold efficiency he'd used to eliminate countless threats. But the words stuck in his throat because they were true. He was bored. Had been for years. The empire was maintenance now, not conquest. The challenges were manufactured, the victories hollow. He'd built exactly what he'd wanted, absolute control, unquestionable authority, and discovered too late that winning completely meant having nothing left to fight for. What do you want, Ms. Morrison? His voice was rough now, stripped of its usual precision. I want you to take a risk, Jade said. Not on me. On yourself. I want you to partner with someone who'll challenge you, who'll push back, who'll make you remember why you started building in the first place. She pulled a flash drive from her pocket and set it on the table between them. That drive contained 6 months of predictive data from Morrison Analytics. Market trends you're missing. Investment opportunities you're blind to. Proof that my system works. She stepped back. Give me the grant. Or don't. But look at that data first. And then ask yourself, when's the last time someone showed you something you didn't already know? Theodore stared at the flash drive like it might explode. This woman had walked into his domain, broken his rules, challenged his authority, and somehow made him feel like he was the one being tested. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, he said. My mother used to say those were the same thing. Jade's smile returned, softer now. Genuine. She also said the only way to change the game is to flip the board. Your mother sounds dangerous. She was. Breast cancer, 3 years ago. The grief flickered across Jade's face like a shadow. She never got to see Morrison Analytics succeed. But she taught me that sometimes you have to break the rules just to get a seat at the table. And there it was. The vulnerability beneath the armor. The wound that drove the defiance. Theodore recognized it because he carried his own. The divorce that had hollowed him out. The years of building walls so high that he'd forgotten what sunlight felt like. They were both fighters. Both scarred. Both exhausted from battles no one else could see. "I'll review your data," Theodore heard himself say. "You'll have my decision by Friday." Jade nodded, gathering her duct-taped portfolio. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "Mr. Grant? Thank you for not throwing me out." "The day's not over yet," he said, but there was no heat in it. She laughed, a real, unguarded sound that seemed to brighten the whole room. "Fair enough." The door closed behind her, and Theodore was alone again. He picked up the flash drive, turning it over in his fingers. Such a small thing to contain so much disruption. He walked to the window, looking out at Manhattan as the sun began its descent. Somewhere in that vast city, Jade Morrison was probably taking the subway back to Brooklyn, back to her one-bedroom apartment and her second-hand equipment, carrying the weight of hope and defiance in equal measure. Theodore plugged the flash drive into his laptop. 2 hours later, he was still reading. And for the first time in a decade, Theodore Grant felt something dangerously close to excitement. The city below had transformed into a constellation of lights, each window a small universe of ambition, struggle, or rest. Theodore hadn't moved from his desk in 6 hours. His jacket hung on the back of his chair. His tie lay coiled on the desk like a shed skin. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled to his elbows, something his staff had never seen, would never believe if told. The data on his screen was impossible. Not impossible in accuracy. He'd spent 3 hours cross-referencing Jade's predictions against actual market outcomes, and her models held up with terrifying precision. Impossible because it revealed the scope of his blindness. Every investment opportunity his team had dismissed as too risky in minority communities, every market trend they'd classified as statistical anomaly, every neighborhood they'd written off as economically stagnant, Jade's algorithms had identified them as opportunities months, sometimes years, in advance. The Oakland property was just the beginning. There were 17 other cases in the last 3 years alone where Morrison Analytics had predicted outcomes that Grant Industries had missed. 17 opportunities totaling over $40 million in potential returns. Theodore pushed back from the desk, running both hands through his hair, another gesture his carefully constructed persona never allowed. He felt like an archaeologist who'd just discovered that his entire career had been built on a map missing half the world. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Still at the office? The lights are on in your tower. Hope the data isn't keeping you up too late. JM." Theodore stared at the message. How did she know he'd still be here? More importantly, how did she have his personal number? He typed back, "How did you get this number?" Her response came immediately, "You're not the only one who knows how to research people, Mr. Grant. Also, your assistant Peter has a very sweet nephew who goes to the same community center where I volunteer." Small world. Despite himself, Theodore felt the corner of his mouth twitch. She'd outmaneuvered him again. He typed, "The data is thorough. We need to discuss implementation." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Finally, "Are you offering me the grant?" Theodore's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The rational answer was yes. Her analytics were superior, her business model was sound, and the potential return on investment was substantial. But something made him hesitate. The grant felt insufficient now, like offering a master chess player a pawn when she'd already demonstrated she could take the king. He typed, "I'm offering you a meeting. Tomorrow. 8 a.m. My office." That's early for someone who's been working since 6 a.m. yesterday. "How do you know when I started working?" "Your security chief texted his team at 6:03 a.m. that you'd arrived. I may have connections in your building. See you at 8, Mr. Grant. Bring coffee." Theodore set down his phone and did something he hadn't done in years. He laughed. Actually laughed, a rusty, surprised sound that echoed in the empty office. This woman was systematically dismantling every defense he'd spent 15 years constructing, and somehow he was enjoying it. He shut down his computer, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the elevator. But as the doors closed, carrying him down from his tower, Theodore couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't descending. He was falling. Jade's office was the living room of her one-bedroom apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant. 3 mismatched monitors sat on a desk built from a repurposed door and cinder blocks. The walls were covered with printouts, market analyses, algorithm flowcharts, sticky notes covered in code and equations. A futon doubled as her couch and, on late nights like this, her bed. She sat cross-legged on said futon, laptop balanced on her knees, eating cold lo mein straight from the container. Her natural hair was wrapped in a silk scarf. An oversized Howard University sweatshirt hung off one shoulder. This was Jade unarmored, no blazer, no performance, just the exhausted, exhilarated version of herself that existed in the hours between ambition and sleep. Her phone lit up with Theodore's final text confirming the morning meeting. She set down the lo mein and pressed both palms to her face, releasing a breath that carried 3 years of weight. "Mama," she whispered to the empty room, "I think I just convinced a billionaire to take me seriously." The apartment didn't answer, but Jade felt the familiar presence anyway, her mother's voice in her head, proud and worried in equal measure. "Baby girl, you've got your daddy's brilliant mind and my stubborn heart. Just make sure you know which one you're using before you walk into a lion's den." Jade's father had been the first in his family to graduate college, a mathematics professor who died of a heart attack when Jade was 19. Her mother had cleaned houses to put Jade through MIT, had worked herself to exhaustion to ensure her daughter had opportunities she'd never had. They'd both died before seeing Morrison Analytics become real, before seeing Jade turn their sacrifices into something that mattered. She opened her laptop and pulled up Theodore Grant's file, the one she'd been building for 6 months, ever since she'd learned about the Heritage Foundation grant. Public information. Mostly. Forbes profiles detailing his rise from a failing real estate legacy to tech industry dominance. Business journals chronicling his reputation for ruthless efficiency. Society page photographs showing him at charity galas, always alone, always with that same carved granite expression. But Jade had looked deeper. She'd found the sealed divorce records, publicly sealed, but the filing dates and locations were accessible. She'd found the trail of properties he'd sold off after the split, a Connecticut estate, a vacation home in the Hamptons, as if he'd been systematically eliminating anything that suggested warmth or home. She'd found the quote from an interview 8 years ago, before the ice had fully set: "Success is building something that outlasts you. Legacy is building something that matters." Somewhere between that interview and now, Theodore Grant had stopped believing in the second half of that statement. Jade understood because she'd almost gone the same way. After her mother died, there'd been 6 months where Morrison Analytics had felt pointless, just numbers and predictions, divorced from the human cost of getting it right. She'd nearly shut down, nearly taken a corporate job that would have buried her brilliance in someone else's machinery. But then she'd helped a woman in her neighborhood avoid foreclosure by predicting a local economic upturn 2 months before it hit. The woman had hugged her and cried and said, "You saved my home." And Jade had remembered why the math mattered. Why the fight mattered. She suspected Theodore had forgotten his own version of that moment. And something in her, the part that had defied him in his own conference room, wanted to help him remember. Her phone buzzed again. Not Theodore this time, but her best friend Rashida. "Girl, tell me you're not still working." Jade smiled and typed back, "Define working. If you're thinking about the billionaire, that counts. Is he as cold in person as he looks in pictures?" Jade paused, remembering the moment in the conference room when Theodore's armor had cracked. When she'd called him bored and watched something real flash behind those slate-gray eyes. She typed, "He's complicated. And I think I just became his favorite problem. Is that good or dangerous?" "Yes." Rashida sent back a string of warning emojis, followed by, "Just remember, billionaires don't change. They acquire." The message settled uneasily in Jade's chest. She knew the risks. She'd walked into Theodore Grant's world with her eyes open, ready for rejection or dismissal. But she hadn't prepared for the possibility that he might actually listen. That he might see her not as a charity case or diversity checkbox but as an equal. That was more dangerous than rejection. Jade closed her laptop and lay back on the futon, staring at a ceiling covered with glow-in-the-dark stars, a remnant from childhood that she'd never had the heart to remove. Tomorrow morning, she'd walk back into that glass tower and sit across from one of the most powerful men in America. And somehow, she'd have to convince him that what she was offering wasn't just data. It was a chance for both of them to become something bigger than the armor they wore. Theodore had arrived at 7, which meant he'd had an hour to regret this meeting approximately 17 times. He'd also ordered coffee, good coffee, from the Italian place 3 blocks away that he hadn't visited personally in years. 2 cups. Black for him. A vanilla latte for Jade, because he'd noticed the remnant of foam on her blazer sleeve yesterday and made an educated guess. The fact that he'd noticed at all was disturbing. Jade arrived at 8:03, which Theodore noted was late enough to establish she wouldn't be controlled by his schedule but early enough to show respect. She wore the same blazer, he was certain now it was her only one, but a different blouse underneath, deep emerald that made her amber eyes more striking. Her hair was down today, natural curls framing her face like a crown. She stopped when she saw the coffee. You remembered. I observed details, Ms. Morrison. It's how I've stayed ahead. It's also how you stay lonely, she said, taking the latte, but we'll unpack that later. Theodore blinked. No one, not his ex-wife, not his therapist, during the 6 sessions he'd attended before deciding therapy was inefficient, not his oldest friend, who'd stopped trying years ago, had ever called him lonely to his face. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Jade sat, but she immediately frowned. This feels wrong. The chair is ergonomically designed and costs more than most people's monthly rent. I meant the power dynamic. She stood again, moved to the sitting area by the window, 2 leather couches facing each other with a coffee table between them. Come sit here instead. This is a conversation, not an interrogation. Theodore should have refused. Should have reasserted control. Instead, he found himself walking to the couch opposite her, coffee in hand, feeling oddly like he was the one being interviewed. Jade kicked off her shoes, scuffed flats that had clearly walked thousands of Brooklyn blocks, and tucked her feet under her on the couch. The gesture was so casual, so unbothered by the intimidation of his space, that Theodore felt his carefully maintained tension ease slightly. I reviewed your data, he said. All of it. It's exceptional. I know. You're also correct that Grant Industries has been operating with significant blind spots in our market analysis. I know that too. Theodore leaned forward slightly. What you may not know is that offering you the $500,000 grant would be an insult at this point. Your analytics platform is worth significantly more than that. Jade's expression didn't change, but Theodore saw her fingers tighten around her cup. What are you proposing? A partnership. Not through the Heritage Foundation, direct integration with Grant Industries. I want to license Morrison Analytics predictive models, incorporate them into our investment strategy, and provide you with the capital and infrastructure to scale. He paused. We're talking about a $20 million investment for 40% equity in your company. The silence that followed was profound. Jade set down her coffee very carefully. You want to buy me. I want to invest in you. There's a difference. Is there? Her voice had changed, lost its warmth. $20 million for 40% means you become the largest shareholder. You get board control. You get final say on strategic direction. You get to turn Morrison Analytics into another division of Grant Industries, scrubbed clean of everything that makes it dangerous to people like you. Theodore felt the conversation tilting. People like me. People who want innovation without disruption. Progress without risk. Diversity as a line item, not a revolution. Jade stood, pacing to the window. I didn't build Morrison Analytics to become a comfortable tool for the establishment. I built it to challenge the establishment. And you can't do that with resources. Theodore countered, standing as well. You're working out of a 1-bedroom apartment with equipment held together by duct tape and force of will. How long can you sustain that? How many opportunities will you miss because you're too proud to accept help? Help. Jade spun to face him. You're not offering help. You're offering assimilation. You want to take everything I've built and smooth off the edges until it fits into your empire without causing trouble. I want to take what you've built and give it the power to actually matter. Theodore's voice rose, something that never happened, something he never allowed. You can be righteous in your apartment, predicting trends that no one listens to, or you can partner with someone who has the influence to implement real change. But you can't have both. Why not? Jade challenged. Why does change have to come from inside the system? Why can't it come from outside, breaking the system down? Because the system breaks back. Theodore realized he was shouting now, his control completely shattered. Because I've watched brilliant people destroy themselves fighting wars they can't win. Because... He stopped abruptly, the words catching in his throat. The room felt too small suddenly, too hot. He turned away from her, back to the window, trying to rebuild the walls she'd somehow demolished in less than 24 hours. Because what? Jade's voice was soft now. She'd moved closer. He could sense her presence behind him, could feel the warmth of her proximity. Because I tried once, Theodore said quietly, to change things from outside. To be the disruptor, the one who broke the rules. He laughed bitterly. My father's company was drowning. I had ideas, aggressive, unconventional ideas that could have saved it. But I was 26 and too proud to compromise. I pushed too hard, fought too recklessly, and I lost everything. The company failed anyway. My father died thinking I'd destroyed his legacy. And I learned that righteous failure is still failure. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Theodore had never told anyone this. Not his ex-wife, not his board, not the journalists who'd written glowing profiles about his rise. The official story was that he'd rebuilt from his father's ashes. The truth was that he'd built from his own. He felt Jade's hand on his shoulder. Light. Tentative. So you built an empire where you'd never lose control again. Yes. And trapped yourself inside it. Theodore turned to face her. They were close now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes, could smell the subtle scent of cocoa butter in her hair. What do you want from me, Jade? It was the first time he'd used her first name. The intimacy of it seemed to surprise them both. I want you to take a real risk, she said. Not a calculated investment with projections and exit strategies. A real risk where you don't control the outcome. Where you trust someone else, trust me, to build something that might fail but might also change everything. And if it fails, then we fail together. As partners. Equals. Her hand was still on his shoulder, and she squeezed gently. $10 million for 25% equity. I maintain majority control and strategic direction. You get board representation and input, but not final say. Morrison Analytics stays independent, keeps its mission, and Grant Industries gets first access to our analytics and insights. Theodore studied her face, the determination there, the vulnerability hiding beneath the strength. This woman was asking him to do the one thing he'd sworn never to do again, bet on someone else's vision more than his own control. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. I'll need guarantees, he said. Protections for the investment. I'll need guarantees too, Jade countered. Protections that you won't try to take over the moment things get difficult. I have lawyers who'll want to negotiate every clause. I have a lawyer too. Well, a law school friend who owes me a favor. She smiled. We'll figure it out. Theodore realized his hand had come up to cover hers on his shoulder. The gesture was unconscious, natural, the first real human contact he'd allowed in years. You're either going to make me very rich or very humiliated. Maybe both, Jade said. But at least you won't be bored. He laughed, that rusty, surprised sound again. You keep breaking my rules. That was the plan from the beginning. They stood there in the morning light, two people from different worlds who'd somehow found themselves orbiting the same dangerous possibility. Theodore knew he should step back, reassert boundaries, protect himself. But he was so tired of protection. So tired of being untouchable. There's one more condition, he said. Jade raised an eyebrow. Already negotiating. Dinner. Tonight. Somewhere that doesn't involve contracts or lawyers or business strategy. Just. He hesitated, the words feeling foreign. Just two people getting to know each other. Jade's smile transformed her entire face. Theodore Grant, are you asking me on a date? I'm asking you to break another rule with me. She laughed, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. 7 p.m. And you're picking somewhere in Brooklyn. I want to see how the other half lives when they leave their glass towers. Deal. They shook hands, formal, professional, but holding on just a moment longer than necessary. When Jade finally left his office, shoes in hand and blazer slung over her shoulder, Theodore stood at the window and felt something he'd thought long dead stirring in his chest. Hope. And the terrifying, exhilarating recognition that he'd just let someone inside his armor for the first time in 15 years. What would you do? Take a safe bet with guaranteed returns, or risk everything for a partnership that could change your life? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Theodore Grant had never taken the subway in his adult life. His driver, Richard, loyal, efficient, invisible, had been navigating Manhattan streets for him for 12 years. But when Jade had texted him the address of the restaurant, she'd added, "And take the train. I want to see if you remember how real people move through the world." So, Theodore stood on the 2 train heading toward Brooklyn, pressed between a teenager with headphones and a woman with 2 grocery bags, feeling more exposed than he had in a decade. His suit, charcoal tonight, slightly less formal than his usual armor, drew a few glances. His discomfort drew more. But something about the experience felt necessary. Like a test he'd forgotten he needed to take. The restaurant Jade had chosen wasn't listed in any guide Theodore's assistant would have consulted. Mama Lucille's occupied a corner storefront in Prospect Heights, its windows steamy with warmth, its sign hand-painted in colors that had faded to something comfortable. The scent of jerk chicken and plantain spilled onto the street, mixing with early spring air and the distant sound of someone's reggae playlist. Theodore hesitated at the door. This wasn't his world, the world of private dining rooms and sommeliers who knew his preferences. This was life unfiltered, community unpackaged. He felt like an anthropologist about to step into a culture he'd only observed from a distance. Then he saw Jade through the window. She sat at a small table near the back, and she was laughing, head thrown back, genuine joy lighting her face as she talked to an older black woman who was clearly the proprietor. Jade wore a yellow sundress that exposed her shoulders, her natural hair pulled into a high bun wrapped in matching yellow fabric. She looked radiant, unguarded, completely at home. Theodore pushed open the door. The restaurant fell silent for precisely 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to register that someone very different had just entered their space. Then the older woman, Mama Lucille herself, Theodore guessed, broke into a wide smile. "You must be Jade's friend." Her voice carried the melody of Jamaica, warm and musical. "Come, come. Any friend of this brilliant girl is welcome here." Jade turned, and her smile when she saw him was worth every uncomfortable moment on the subway. "You actually took the train. You dared me to." Theodore approached the table, hyper-aware of the curious eyes tracking him. "I don't back down from challenges. I've noticed." Jade gestured to the seat across from her. "Mama Lucille, this is Theodore. Theodore, this is Mama Lucille. She makes the best oxtail in Brooklyn and has been feeding me since I moved to the neighborhood 3 years ago." Mama Lucille squeezed Theodore's shoulder with a grip that suggested she could probably still throw a grown man if necessary. "You look too thin. I'll bring you the special. And ginger beer. You need something to sweeten you up." Before Theodore could respond, she'd swept back to the kitchen, leaving him alone with Jade and approximately 15 pairs of very interested eyes. "I'm being evaluated," Theodore said quietly, settling into his chair. "You are," Jade confirmed cheerfully. "Welcome to community dining. Everyone here knows everyone, and they're all trying to figure out if you're worthy of my time." "Am I? We'll see." She leaned forward, elbows on the table, casual in a way that would horrify every etiquette instructor Theodore had ever endured. "Tell me something real, Theodore. Not a business strategy or a negotiation tactic. Something true." The request landed like a stone in still water. Theodore had spent 15 years perfecting the art of revealing nothing, of keeping conversations transactional and surfaces smooth. But sitting across from Jade, in this warm restaurant that smelled like home and belonging, he felt the armor crack again. "I haven't enjoyed a meal in years," he said quietly. "Food is fuel. Dinner meetings are strategy sessions. I can't remember the last time I sat down somewhere just to be." Jade's expression softened. "What happened to you?" "Life." Theodore's fingers traced patterns on the worn table. "Success. The realization that the higher you climb, the more isolated you become. That's a choice, though. Isolation. Is it?" He met her eyes. "When you have billions of dollars, everyone wants something from you. Every conversation is transactional. Every relationship is conditional. After a while, you stop trying to find the genuine ones because the disappointment becomes exhausting. So you built walls. I built an empire where I didn't need anyone. But you're lonely." It wasn't a question. Theodore wanted to deny it. Should have denied it. Instead, he said, desperately. The word hung between them, raw, honest, terrifying. Theodore had just admitted something he'd never said aloud, not even to himself during the darkest nights in his glass tower. And Jade received it with such gentle understanding that he felt something in his chest begin to thaw. "I get it," she said softly. "After my mother died, I convinced myself that Morrison Analytics was enough. That if I could just build something that mattered, I wouldn't feel the emptiness. But algorithms don't hug you back. Success doesn't call you on hard days to check if you're okay." What changed? Nothing changed. I just got tired of pretending. Jade reached across the table and took his hand, a simple gesture that felt revolutionary. "We're both lonely, Theodore. We've both built walls to protect ourselves from getting hurt again. But at some point, we have to decide if safety is worth the cost." Before Theodore could respond, Mama Lucille arrived with plates that could feed small armies: oxtail swimming in rich gravy, rice and peas, fried plantains, festival, sweet fried dough that Theodore had never encountered, and coleslaw that looked nothing like the sad, mayonnaise-laden version he'd endured at company picnics. "Eat," Mama Lucille commanded. "And you," she pointed at Theodore, "you need to relax those shoulders before you snap something. This is food, not a business meeting." She left before Theodore could explain that he didn't remember how to relax. But then Jade picked up a piece of festival, dipped it in the oxtail gravy, and handed it to him with an encouraging smile. "Trust me. Taste this and tell me life isn't worth living." Theodore took the offered food, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The first bite was a revelation, sweet and savory, rich and comforting, the kind of food that tasted like it was made with love instead of precision. He closed his eyes involuntarily, and when he opened them, Jade was grinning. "There it is," she said. "That's the first genuine expression I've seen from you. This is amazing, life-changing, worth breaking your diet for. All of the above." Theodore tried the oxtail, and it was even better. Meat so tender it fell apart, gravy so flavorful it told a story of generations and care. "How did I not know this existed?" "Because you've been living in a glass tower eating food that costs $300 a plate but tastes like expensive cardboard." Jade loaded her own fork. "Money can buy a lot of things, Theodore, but it can't buy soul." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the restaurant's warmth wrapping around them like a blanket. Theodore noticed things he'd never paid attention to before: the way older couples shared their meals without needing to fill silence with conversation, the way teenagers laughed too loud and too free, the way Mama Lucille moved through her restaurant like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of community. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Jade said eventually, wiping her mouth with a paper napkin. $10 million for 25%. Morrison Analytics stays independent." Theodore set down his fork. Here it was, the real purpose of this dinner, the business beneath the connection. He felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed. And I have questions. Real ones, not negotiation tactics. She met his eyes. "Why do you want this partnership, Theodore? The real reason. Not the ROI projections or the market advantages. Why do you want to work with me specifically?" The question was a trap and a gift. Theodore could retreat to comfortable territory, talk about her analytics, her business acumen, the strategic value she represented. Or he could step off the cliff and tell the truth. He chose the cliff. "Because you make me want to be better," he said. "Not richer, not more successful. Better. You walked into my office and saw through 15 years of carefully constructed armor in less than 15 minutes. You challenged me without trying to destroy me. You showed me what I'd become, this efficient, isolated machine, and instead of judging me for it, you offered me a way back." Theodore leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something raw. "I haven't cared about anything in years, Jade. I've been going through the motions, building wealth I don't need, maintaining an empire that no longer brings me any satisfaction. And then you showed up and reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for, that there are still people worth trusting." He paused, struggling with words that felt foreign. "So yes, I want the partnership because Morrison Analytics is brilliant and profitable and strategically valuable. But I also want it because working with you makes me feel alive for the first time in a decade. And that's worth more than any ROI projection." Jade's eyes were bright, with tears or emotion or both. Theodore couldn't tell. She squeezed his hand, the one she'd been holding throughout his confession. "That's the first time you've been completely honest with me," she said. "And it's terrifying." "Why terrifying?" Because I feel the same way. Jade's voice trembled slightly. I came to you for funding. For validation. For a chance to prove Morrison Analytics deserves to exist. But somewhere between breaking your rules and eating Mama Lucille's oxtail with you, this stopped being just about business. She pulled her hand back, and Theodore felt the loss like a physical ache. I need you to understand something, Theodore. I've worked my entire life to build something that matters. My parents sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities they never had. Morrison Analytics isn't just a company to me, it's a promise. A promise that their struggles meant something. I understand that. Do you? Because here's what terrifies me. I'm starting to care about you as much as I care about my company. And that's dangerous. Because what happens when the business gets hard? What happens when we disagree about strategy or direction? What happens if this thing between us, she gestured at the charged space between them, falls apart? Do I lose my company and my heart in the same disaster? Theodore felt the weight of her fear because he shared it. I don't have an answer that makes that safer. I know. That's what makes it real. Jade looked around the restaurant, at Mama Lucille chatting with regulars, at the community that had formed in this small space. My whole life, I've had to be twice as good to get half the respect. I've had to fight for every opportunity, prove myself in every room. And I've learned to protect myself by trusting no one completely. She turned back to him. But I want to trust you, Theodore. I want to believe that you see me as a partner, not a project. That you see Morrison Analytics as something to support, not something to acquire and control. I want to believe that this, she gestured between them again, is real and not just the excitement of something different. It's real. Theodore reached across the table, taking both her hands now. And I'm terrified too. I haven't let anyone close in 15 years. I haven't allowed myself to be vulnerable or uncertain or need someone. But I need you, Jade. Not just your analytics or your brilliance. You. The woman who breaks rules and eats oxtail and laughs like sunlight and makes me remember why I started building things in the first place. He took a breath, preparing to jump off another cliff. So here's my counter-proposal. $10 million for 25% equity in Morrison Analytics, exactly as you outlined. You maintain complete control of strategic direction. I get board representation, but I promise, actually promise, to never try to take over. And we figure out this thing between us without letting it destroy the business or each other. That's a terrible business proposal, Jade said, but she was smiling through tears now. There are no guarantees. No protections. Just trust. Just trust, Theodore agreed. Which is the scariest thing I've ever offered anyone. Jade was quiet for a long moment, studying their clasped hands on the worn table. Around them, the restaurant continued its symphony, laughter, conversation, the clatter of plates and the sizzle of cooking. Life, messy and beautiful and uncontrolled. Okay, she said finally. Yes. To all of it. The partnership, the risk, the terrifying possibility that we might actually build something amazing together. Okay, Theodore echoed, and felt something shift in his chest, the sound of walls finally, completely falling. They sat there grinning at each other like fools, hands clasped, while Mama Lucille appeared with coconut cake and 2 forks. You two done dancing around each other yet? She asked, her voice full of knowing amusement. Because the whole restaurant has been watching, and we're all tired of the suspense. Jade laughed, that brilliant, unguarded sound. We're done dancing, Mama. Good. Now eat cake and maybe remember to breathe. You both look like you've been holding your breath for years. She was right. Theodore realized he had been holding his breath, for years, for decades, for his entire adult life. And now, finally, he could exhale. They shared the coconut cake in comfortable silence, the sweetness of it mixing with the sweetness of possibility. Outside, Brooklyn moved through its evening rhythms, sirens in the distance, music from passing cars, the chatter of people heading home or heading out. The world, vast and complicated and beautiful. I have one more question, Theodore said as they finished the last bites. What happens now? Now. Jade smiled. Now we go back to your glass tower tomorrow morning and sign papers that make us officially partners. Then we start building something that actually matters. And somewhere in there, her smile turned playful. You're going to teach me how to navigate your world, and I'm going to teach you how to live in mine. That sounds like a lot of rule-breaking. That's the point. She stood, offering her hand. Come on. Walk me home. It's only 20 minutes, and I want you to see my neighborhood. The real Brooklyn, not the gentrified version you probably invest in. Theodore stood, placing money on the table, far more than the meal cost, but Mama Lucille's food deserved more than market value. They said their goodbyes to a restaurant full of knowing smiles and walked out into the spring evening. Brooklyn at night was a revelation. They walked past brownstones with lights glowing golden in windows, past corner stores still open and bustling, past a playground where teenagers played basketball under fluorescent lights, past a small church where a choir practiced hymns that spilled onto the sidewalk like prayers. Jade narrated as they walked, pointing out landmarks that mattered to her: the bodega where the owner gave her free coffee on hard mornings, the barbershop where old men gathered to debate politics, the community garden where neighbors grew vegetables and built friendships. This was her world, interconnected, authentic, rich with relationships that money couldn't buy. This is what Morrison Analytics is really about, Jade said as they paused at a corner, watching a grandmother help her grandchildren learn to ride bikes. Not just predicting markets or identifying opportunities. It's about making sure communities like this get the resources they deserve. Making sure they're not invisible in algorithms built by people who never bothered to look. Theodore understood then, really understood. Morrison Analytics wasn't a business to Jade. It was an act of love. A way of saying that her community, her people, her world mattered just as much as his glass tower and his empire. I want to help you do that, he said. Not as an investor looking for returns, but as a partner who believes in what you're building. Even if it challenges everything you've built. Especially then. They reached Jade's building, a 5-story walk-up with a faded brick facade and a front stoop where a couple sat sharing a bottle of wine. Jade climbed the first 3 steps, then turned to face Theodore. They were almost eye level now. This is terrifying, she said softly. Completely, Theodore agreed. But also right. Yes. Jade leaned forward and kissed him, gentle, tentative, sweet. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but Theodore felt those 3 seconds rearrange his entire understanding of what connection could feel like. When she pulled back, her smile was radiant. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Your office. We sign the papers and start building something real. Tomorrow, Theodore confirmed. And Jade. Yeah. Thank you for breaking my rules. Her laugh echoed in the spring night, and Theodore carried that sound with him all the way back to Manhattan. When he finally reached his penthouse apartment, all glass and chrome and expensive emptiness, it felt different. Not like home, not yet. But like something he could maybe learn to transform into one. He pulled out his phone and texted Jade, made it home. Already missing the oxtail. Her response came quickly, the oxtail or the company? Both. Definitely both. Get some sleep, Theodore. Tomorrow, we start changing the world. Theodore looked out at the Manhattan skyline, at his kingdom of glass and steel, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because he'd conquered or controlled or accumulated, but because he'd finally, terrifyingly, beautifully let someone in. And that was worth more than any empire he'd ever built. The morning sun painted Theodore's office in shades of gold and possibility. The room looked different now, subtle changes that would have been invisible to most, but revolutionary to anyone who'd known the space before. A small fiddle-leaf fig plant sat on the corner of his desk, a gift from Jade who'd insisted that living things belong in living spaces. The rigid chair arrangement had been softened, the couches repositioned to face each other rather than the window. And on the wall behind his desk, alongside the awards and accolades, hung a framed photograph of Prospect Heights at sunset, Brooklyn, beautiful and unapologetic. Theodore stood at his desk reviewing contracts, but his attention kept drifting to the clock. Jade was coming in this morning for their weekly strategy meeting, and despite seeing her nearly every day for the past 6 weeks, he still felt that familiar spark of anticipation when he knew she was close. The past 6 weeks had been a masterclass in controlled chaos. The official partnership announcement had sent shockwaves through the business community. Theodore Grant, the man who'd spent 15 years building an empire on absolute control, had partnered with a relatively unknown analytic startup, and not just partnered, but done so on terms that gave him minority control. The board had been displeased. His investors had been confused. The business press had been fascinated. But the results spoke for themselves. Morrison Analytics, with Grant Industries' resources behind it, had already identified 3 major investment opportunities that Theodore's traditional team had missed. They'd successfully predicted a market shift in renewable energy stocks 2 weeks before Wall Street caught on, netting Grant Industries a $12 million gain. More importantly, they'd helped a black-owned construction firm in Detroit secure a contract that would have gone to a competitor, creating 60 jobs and proving that Jade's mission of economic justice could coexist with profit. The transformation hadn't been smooth. There'd been resistance from Theodore's executive team, skepticism from potential clients, and one spectacular argument between Theodore and Jade about whether to prioritize a high-return investment in a gentrifying neighborhood versus a low-return investment in community development. Jade had won that argument, and Theodore had learned something crucial. Losing control sometimes meant finding better solutions. But more than the business success, Theodore had discovered something he'd thought lost forever. He'd discovered what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself, to wake up excited about the day ahead, to laugh without calculating the strategic value of humor. He'd discovered partnership, connection, love. Though he hadn't said that word yet. Not out loud. His phone buzzed. Jade, running 5 minutes late. Mama Lucille caught me and insisted I take jerk chicken for lunch. Hope you're hungry. Theodore smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made him look 10 years younger. He typed back, always hungry when Mama Lucille's involved. See you soon. He was still smiling when Peter knocked and entered with an expression that Theodore had learned to read as urgent but not catastrophic. Sir, Maxwell Hendricks is on line 2. He says it's important. Theodore's smile faded slightly. Maxwell Hendricks was the CEO of Hendricks Financial, one of Grant Industries' oldest partners and one of Theodore's few remaining connections to the old guard, the men who'd built empires the same way he had, through ruthless efficiency and emotional isolation. Put him through. Theodore picked up the phone. Maxwell. Theodore. Maxwell's voice carried that particular tone of concern that powerful men use when they're about to criticize each other under the guise of friendship. I've been meaning to call. I've been hearing interesting things about your new venture. Morrison Analytics has been highly successful. I'm sure it has. But Theodore, I'm calling as a friend. This partnership, this woman, people are talking. They're questioning your judgment. Theodore's jaw tightened. My judgment has produced exceptional returns. Your judgment used to produce exceptional returns, Maxwell corrected. Now it's producing headlines about diversity initiatives and community development. That's not what Grant Industries was built on. Perhaps it should have been. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, Theodore, you've built one of the most respected firms in the industry by maintaining standards. By not letting sentiment interfere with business. This woman, this Jade Morrison, she's changing you. And not in ways that serve your legacy. Theodore felt anger rising, cold and precise, the kind he'd weaponized for years. But beneath it, something else stirred. Clarity. You're right, Maxwell. She is changing me. She's reminding me that there's more to success than accumulation. That legacy isn't just about what you build, but who you become in the building. That's sentiment talking, not strategy. Maybe I've had enough strategy. Theodore stood, walking to the window, but not to look at his kingdom this time. To look at the city, vast and complex, full of Jades and Mama Lucille's and communities that existed outside his glass tower. I spent 15 years building walls, Maxwell. Building an empire where I didn't need anyone, where I could control everything. And I was miserable. You were successful. I was lonely. The admission came easier now, after 6 weeks of practice. Jade didn't make me weak, Maxwell. She made me human again. And if that costs me the respect of people who measure worth only in dollars, then I'll pay that price gladly. Another long silence. Then Maxwell's voice, cooler now, I hope you know what you're doing, Theodore. Because the business world doesn't forgive sentiment. And when this inevitable falls apart, and it will, you'll find that the empire you've built isn't as forgiving as you think. The line went dead. Theodore stood at the window, phone still in hand, feeling the weight of Maxwell's warning. It would have terrified him 6 weeks ago, the threat of losing respect, losing status, being seen as weak. But now, all he felt was a strange sense of freedom. He'd spent 15 years caring what men like Maxwell thought. He was done. The door opened, And Jade walked in carrying a bag from Amar Lucille's and wearing a navy pantsuit that actually fit properly. One of the few concessions she'd made to corporate culture, though she'd paired it with bright yellow heels that made Theodore smile every time he saw them. "You look stressed," she said immediately, setting down the food. "What happened?" Theodore turned from the window. "Maxwell Hendricks called. He's concerned about my judgment, about our partnership. He thinks you're making me soft." Jade's expression hardened. "And what did you tell him?" "That he was right. That you're changing me. That I'm grateful for it." Theodore moved toward her, and the distance between them felt charged with possibility. "And that if being human again means losing the respect of people who mistake isolation for strength, I'll accept that trade." Jade's expression softened, but her eyes remained sharp. "This is going to keep happening. You know. People are going to question us. Question whether a billionaire white man and a black woman from Brooklyn can really build something together without it being performative or problematic or doomed. I know. They're going to watch for us to fail. They're going to assume that when things get hard, you'll revert to type and try to take control. I won't." "How do I know that?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuine, vulnerable. "How do I know that when the pressure builds, when the board starts questioning your decisions, when profits dip or we face real adversity, you won't decide that partnership is too complicated and control is easier?" Theodore closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his. "Because I've lived that life, Jade. I've had control. I've had the empire where I needed no one and nothing could touch me. And it was the emptiest existence imaginable." He squeezed her hands. "What we're building, this partnership, this relationship, it's messy and complicated and sometimes terrifying. But it's real. And I would rather have real and imperfect with you than perfect and hollow alone." Jade's eyes were bright. "That's a very good answer. I've been practicing." She laughed, and Theodore felt that sound settle into his chest like warmth. "So what do we do about Maxwell and all the others who are waiting for us to fail?" "We prove them wrong." Theodore released one of her hands but kept the other, leading her to the couches. "And I have an idea about how to do that." They sat, not across from each other this time, but on the same couch, shoulders touching in the comfortable intimacy they developed. Theodore pulled out a folder he'd been working on all morning. "Morrison Analytics has proven that your predictive models work," he said. "We've made money, we've helped communities, and we've demonstrated that economic justice and profit aren't mutually exclusive. But we're still seen as an experiment. A pet project. So how do we change that? We go bigger." Theodore opened the folder, revealing a proposal he'd been drafting. "The Heritage Foundation grant, the one you originally applied for, gives $500,000 to one business annually. It's well-intentioned but insufficient. What if we transformed it?" Jade leaned forward, scanning the documents. "You want to create a new fund?" "Not just a fund. A venture capital firm specifically focused on minority-owned businesses in underserved communities, using Morrison Analytics predictive models to identify opportunities that traditional VC firms miss." Theodore's voice carried genuine excitement now, something his board would barely recognize. "We seed it with $50 million from Grant Industries, and we bring in other investors who understand that this isn't charity, it's smart business." Jade was reading faster now, her expression shifting from interested to amazed. "You want to commit $50 million. I want to commit to changing the system," Theodore corrected. "For 15 years, I've operated within the rules designed to protect existing power structures and exclude brilliant people like you. You taught me that sometimes you have to break the rules to fix what's broken. So let's break them. The board will fight you on this. Let them." Theodore's smile was sharp now, the old predator energy channeled towards something constructive. "I still control Grant Industries. And if they want to challenge me, they'll discover that I'm much more dangerous when I'm fighting for something I believe in than when I'm just accumulating wealth." Jade set down the proposal and turned to face him fully. "You realize what this means, right? This isn't just a big investment. This is you publicly declaring that you're committed to this path. That you're committed to me, to Morrison Analytics, to everything we represent. There's no going back from this." "I don't want to go back." Theodore took both her hands again. "Jade, these past 6 weeks have been the best of my life. Not because of the returns or the success, but because I'm finally building something that matters. With someone who sees me, really sees me, and challenges me to be better. He took a breath, preparing to jump off the biggest cliff yet. I'm in love with you. And I know that's complicated, and I know it adds layers of messiness to an already complex partnership. But I'm tired of pretending that this is just business. It stopped being just business the moment you walked into my conference room and told me I was bored. Jade's smile was radiant. Theodore Grant, that might be the most inefficient declaration of love I've ever heard. I'm not good at this. You're learning. She leaned forward and kissed him, deeper this time, more certain, full of promise and possibility. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. I love you too. Even though you still can't dance, you've never been to a black barbershop, and you think $300 wine tastes better than the $15 bottle I brought to your place last week. It doesn't, does it? Not even close. She laughed. But I love that you're willing to learn. I love that you're willing to be wrong. I love that you let me break your rules and then helped me build something better in their place. Theodore pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning sun painting them in gold. Outside, Manhattan moved through its rhythms, ambitious, relentless, full of people building and breaking and building again. So we do this? Jade asked finally. We launch the fund, we make the commitment, we show the world that this partnership is real. We do this, Theodore confirmed. Together. Together, Jade echoed. Then, with a mischievous smile, but we're announcing it at Mama Lucille's, not some fancy press conference. If we're breaking rules, we might as well break them properly. Theodore laughed, that sound that came so easily now, so naturally. Deal. Though I'm not sure the business press knows how to find Prospect Heights. Then they'll learn. Just like you did. The restaurant had been transformed, packed with reporters, investors, community leaders, and everyone who'd been part of Theodore and Jade's journey. Mama Lucille herself had insisted on catering, which meant the press conference smelled like jerk chicken and coconut cake instead of the usual coffee and tension. Theodore stood at a small podium that looked absurd in the informal setting, Jade beside him in a purple dress that made her look like royalty. They'd spent the morning finalizing details of what they were now calling the Morrison Grant Community Capital Fund, $50 million in initial capital, with commitments from 5 other major investors who'd been convinced by the data, the mission, and the undeniable chemistry between Theodore and Jade. Thank you all for coming, Theodore began, and his voice carried the warmth of someone who'd finally learned to speak from the heart. 3 months ago, I stood in a conference room and met someone who would change my life. Jade Morrison walked in and challenged everything I believed about business, about success, about what it means to build something that matters. He turned to Jade, who smiled encouragingly. I spent 15 years building an empire based on control. I thought that success meant needing no one, that power meant standing alone. I was wrong. The Morrison Grant Community Capital Fund represents a different philosophy, that real success means lifting others, that true power means sharing it, and that the best investments aren't just in businesses, they're in people and communities. Jade stepped to the microphone. This fund will provide capital to minority-owned businesses in underserved communities, using predictive analytics to identify opportunities that traditional investors miss. But more than that, it represents a commitment to changing the rules, to recognizing that economic justice and profitability aren't opposites, they're partners. She looked at Theodore, and the connection between them was visible, undeniable. Theodore and I come from different worlds. We've faced skepticism, resistance, and predictions that this partnership would fail. But we're standing here today because we believed in something bigger than our individual success. We believed that breaking down walls and building bridges was worth the risk. Theodore returned to the microphone. We're announcing our first 5 investments today. Businesses in Detroit, Oakland, Brooklyn, Houston, and Atlanta. Together, they represent over $15 million in capital and will create over 300 jobs in communities that have been systematically excluded from investment. And this is just the beginning. The room erupted in questions, reporters asking about returns, investors asking about structure, community leaders asking about application processes. But through it all, Theodore kept his hand on the small of Jade's back, a constant reminder that they were in this together. After the formal announcement, Mama Lucille insisted everyone eat, and the press conference dissolved into something warmer, community. Theodore found himself talking to a young entrepreneur from the Bronx whose food distribution business was being considered for funding. Jade was surrounded by reporters who wanted to know how a woman from Brooklyn had convinced a billionaire to bet on her vision. But eventually, they found each other again, slipping away to the small courtyard behind the restaurant where Jade had first brought Theodore weeks ago. "We did it," Jade said, leaning against the brick wall, exhausted and exhilarated. "We did," Theodore agreed, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. "Though I think Mama Lucille gets at least partial credit for feeding everyone into submission." Jade laughed. "That's her superpower." She turned to face him. "Serious now. Are you ready for this? Really ready? Because once we start funding these businesses, once we commit to this path, there's no going back to the safe version of Theodore Grant." "I don't want safe anymore." Theodore took her hands, the gesture as natural as breathing now. "I want real. I want messy. I want to build something with you that changes lives and breaks rules and proves that partnership is stronger than control. Even when it's hard. Especially then." Jade smiled, that brilliant, transformative smile that had first cracked Theodore's armor. "Then let's keep breaking rules together." They kissed in the courtyard, surrounded by brick and Brooklyn sky, while inside Mama Lucille's restaurant the future was being negotiated over jerk chicken and coconut cake. It wasn't the ending Theodore would have imagined 15 years ago when he was building his empire of ice. But it was so much better. Because he'd learned that real power wasn't about standing alone at the top of a glass tower. It was about standing beside someone who made you braver, better, more human. It was about breaking your own rules to build something bigger than yourself. It was about love. The office had undergone a complete transformation. The walls that had once displayed only awards now held photographs: Mama Lucille's restaurant, the Detroit manufacturing facility they'd helped fund, a community center in Oakland, a group photo of all the Morrison Grant-funded entrepreneurs at their first annual summit. The rigid, controlled space had become something alive, warm, full of evidence that work could be more than transactions. Theodore sat at his desk, though he spent far less time there now, reviewing the year-end report for the Morrison Grant Community Capital Fund. The numbers were stunning. 23 businesses funded. 417 jobs created. $42 million in economic activity generated in communities that had been written off by traditional investors. And a return on investment of 18%, proving definitively that economic justice and profit could coexist. But the numbers Theodore cared about most weren't financial. 7 letters from business owners thanking them for believing when no one else would. 3 success stories featured in national publications, changing the narrative about who deserved investment. 1 viral video of a grandmother crying when her grandson's business received funding, saying, "Finally, somebody sees us." That was the real return on investment. The door opened, and Jade walked in wearing jeans and a Morrison Analytics hoodie. The office dress code had become significantly more relaxed. She carried 2 cups of coffee from the Italian place and a folder of new analytics. "You're going to love this," she said, settling onto the couch. "We've identified a pattern in emerging markets in the Southeast. 3 cities showing indicators of major economic growth in Black and Latino communities. If we act now, we can fund businesses before the gentrification wave hits and make sure the people who built those communities get to benefit from the growth." Theodore joined her on the couch, taking his coffee. "Show me." They spent the next hour reviewing data, debating strategy, challenging each other's assumptions. It was the kind of partnership Theodore had once thought impossible. Equal, dynamic, built on trust and respect rather than control and hierarchy. When they finished, Jade leaned back and studied him. "You look happy." "I am." Theodore realized it was true without hesitation. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm actually happy. Because of the fund's success. Because of you." He took her hand, the gesture automatic now. "Because you walked into my life and broke all my rules and showed me that there was a better way to build something that mattered." Jade smiled. "You know what my mother would say if she could see us now." "What?" "She'd say, 'Baby girl, you found a good man. Now make sure he keeps growing.'" Jade's eyes were bright with tears and joy. "And then she'd probably tell you that you need to learn how to dance properly because the way you move at events is embarrassing." Theodore laughed. "She'd be right on both counts." "She usually was." Jade squeezed his hand. "I wish she could see Morrison Analytics now. See what we've built together. See that her sacrifices, her belief in me, led to something real." "She sees," Theodore said softly. "And she's proud." Just like my father would be, despite how much I blamed him for not understanding my vision. We're both building on their shoulders, Jade. Making their sacrifices mean something. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Manhattan move through its afternoon rhythms outside the window. But it didn't feel like Theodore was looking down on the city anymore. It felt like he was part of it, connected, engaged, alive. His phone buzzed with a text from Peter. Reminder, tonight's dinner with a new batch of fund applicants. Mama Lucille's, 7 p.m. Theodore smiled and showed Jade the message. We're going to need a bigger restaurant soon. Mama Lucille's already talking about expanding. Apparently, feeding revolutionaries is good for business. Jade stood, stretching. Come on. Let's go visit the Brooklyn office. I want you to meet the new analysts we hired. The Brooklyn office was what they now called Jade's original one-bedroom apartment, which had been converted into Morrison Analytics Research Hub. They'd kept it deliberately, a reminder of where they'd started, of the duct-taped portfolio and second-hand equipment that had launched a revolution. As they rode the elevator down from Theodore's tower, their hands linked, Theodore reflected on the journey. A year ago, he'd been a man encased in ice, powerful but alone, successful but miserable. Then Jade Morrison had walked into his conference room, looked him in the eye, smiled, and broken every rule he'd built his life around. She'd saved him. Not by making him weak, but by showing him that real strength meant vulnerability. That real power meant partnership. That real success meant building something bigger than yourself. And in return, he'd helped her build something that changed lives, that proved her mother's sacrifices mattered, that demonstrated that brilliance and determination could overcome systemic barriers when given the right support. They'd saved each other. And together, they were saving communities, creating opportunities, rewriting the rules of investment and success. As they stepped out onto the Manhattan sidewalk, heading toward the subway that would take them to Brooklyn, Theodore realized something profound. He'd spent 15 years building an empire from the top of a tower, alone. But the real empire, the one that mattered, the one that would outlast him, was being built from the ground up, in partnership, surrounded by community. Jade looked at him and smiled. What are you thinking about? That I used to believe no one could challenge me and survive, Theodore said. And then you did more than challenge me. You changed me. You made me better. We made each other better, Jade corrected. That's how partnership works. Then let's keep getting better. Together. Together, Jade agreed. They descended into the subway, hand in hand, two people from different worlds who'd built a bridge between them. And in that bridge, they'd found not just business success or personal happiness, but something revolutionary, proof that breaking rules, taking risks, and choosing partnership over control could change not just individual lives, but entire communities. The millionaire who thought he was untouchable had been touched. The woman who thought she'd have to fight alone had found a partner. And together, they'd built something that actually mattered. That was the real victory. That was the real ending. That was love. Theodore and Jade's experience shows us that true power isn't about control, it's about connection. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone break our rules and help us build something better. Have you ever had someone challenge you to become a better version of yourself? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how partnership and vulnerability changed your life. Thank you for experiencing this journey with me, my beautiful family. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it.